In the 1950s, America had broken free from the shackles of wartime economics. It was walking with the swagger of a nation that had the world by the tail. Scientists had harnessed nuclear energy. Jet-propelled airplanes were breaking speed records, and the race to space was on. But perhaps more than anything else, one thing melded imagination and consumerism, putting this era in perfect context. The concept car. Unlike satellites, rockets, and jet planes, these dream cars were accessible. People flocked to auto shows to see concept cars in their titanium-bodied glory. They were snapshots of how America perceived its future. They were simply out of sight, unforgettable. But what happened to them? Most were destroyed. Some just plain vanished. But amazingly, some are still here. In the middle of the Great Depression, Chrysler undertook a bold experiment.
Well, there was only one Trifon, that's why you haven't seen too many laying around.
It was a secret project that involved some of the most daring innovators of the time.
So he contacted Orville Wright of the Frame Wright brothers.
The result was a car that looked like it could fly. "35 years later, Westinghouse Electric took a bold risk of their own.
In 1967, congressional legislation came out alerting Americans that, hey, we've got to breathe this air. We can't keep dumping pollutants into it.
It was a big problem that required a small solution.
So Westinghouse developed a golf cart into an automobile.
This is the 1932 Trifon. Today it is battered and scratched, almost anonymous. 81 years ago, it was the center of the boldest experiment in automotive history.
It was developed in secret. They didn't want anybody knowing that Chrysler was doing a special car. This was a platform for them to work on, for them to learn from. I think you can look at the vehicle and know that there weren't art guys going crazy with pens and pencils designing this vehicle. It was a revolutionary vehicle that they were working on. Not only was it the first production vehicle to take aerodynamics into account, but it was really changing the architecture of the vehicle.
The idea of incorporating aerodynamics into automobile design started when Carl Breer, Chrysler's top engineer at the time, was taking a Sunday stroll and happened to look up at the sky.
The story goes that he saw a flock of geese flying and was amazed with them, and all of a sudden understood that they were actually airplanes at the time. And he had a thought, why are we making cars as aerodynamic as airplanes?
To answer that question, Breer called in the nation's leading expert in aviation.
So he contacted Orville Wright of the Frame Wright brothers to help us build a scale model wind tunnel so we could test models in them.
Eventually, Breer and Wright enlisted the help of the University of Michigan to do the first wind tunnel testing on a full-sized car.
When we first started developing the wind tunnels, they put the current vehicles from the 1920s and 1930s in there. And the funny thing they found out was the vehicle of that era was more aerodynamic in reverse than it was forward. So they knew that they could do something to improve, the vehicle ride and the gas mileage with it. While gas was 10 cents a gallon back then, 10 cents was still a lot of money back then. Comparatively speaking, I don't think it's near the $4 or $5 range we're talking now, but that was an expense that went into operating a motor vehicle. If you lower the expenses on any motor vehicle, you're going to attract customers. Do you want an aerodynamic or a gas-saving vehicle? And the answer is yes. People wanted to save money when they operated their vehicles.
The Trifon was the result of that research. Its smooth, flowing lines look sculpted rather than built.
In the 1920s vehicles, you've got the straight-up radiator in the front, fenders that are exterior and mounted to the body, front and rear, the headlights that sit on those fenders, very square, boxy thing. While the Trifon is rounded and sleek, the fenders are integrated in the body, as are the headlights and the grille and the radiator. It all becomes one smooth unit.
The changes inside the car were just as dramatic. In cars of the day, backseat passengers sat directly over the rear axle. This made for a horribly uncomfortable ride.
You got to remember back in the 1930s, the roads were not very good. So you're driving on dirt, gravel roads, lots of potholes, and the passengers would actually feel that.
In the Trifon, they reconfigured the chassis, bringing the passengers closer to the middle of the car.
They moved the axles out and they widened the vehicle, so the passengers actually sat within the axle range. So it created a more snug passenger compartment. It was a wider car. It wasn't any longer, but they stretched where the axles were, and they actually had to move the engine 30 inches forward to accomplish that. They took to northern Michigan, and they had property up there, and they ran it around on the back roads to see if the ride, handling, and comfort was what they expected it to be, and they did find out it was. They did in such secret that executives that drove up there actually drove in competitor vehicles, so it didn't look like a whole bunch of Chryslers were driving into the same area at the same time and attract attention.
Chrysler's top secret vehicle had one more experimental element. Hidden under the sleek new body was a completely unique type of frame.
Up till that point, you had a vehicle frame with the axles bolted to it and a body dropped on it. This was the first time they actually integrated the frame along with the body structure itself, and they actually used a tubular steel frame. So it's almost like a roll cage integrated into the frame, so it's a very strong, durable structure.
After 2 years of testing the Trifon in the wind tunnel and on back roads, Chrysler was ready to unveil their creation. The question remained, though, was the American public ready to buy what they had built? Then in 1934, it was renamed the Airflow and unveiled to the public.
The reaction was generally good at the time. The public did like it. The writers at the time did like the vehicle. It was something very new, so it got a lot of press, which is what Chrysler was looking for.
Chrysler spared no expense to prove to America that this newfangled automobile was safe and sturdy.
Cast your eyes up the face of that cliff. What a drop! 110 feet, and that's as high as an 8-story building.
They did some promotional videos that we jokingly call old testing, where they pushed the vehicle off a cliff. It rolled end over end, landed on its wheels and tires. They came up, opened and closed all the doors, rolled up and down all the windows, and drove it away.
Will the car run? I'll say it will. There it goes, under its own power.
They also took it to the Bonneville Salt Flats to show off its speed.
The car which is furnishing the thrills is a Chrysler Airflow Imperial.
And to get people excited about their new product.
Harry Hart's the famed driver of the time and a co-driver. They drove it for 24 hours on a 10-mile loop and broke over 29 speed records of the time.
One by one, the Chrysler has shattered the proudest records of its class. That takes power, glorious power, and it takes something more, airflow design. Its power is converted into speed rather than wasted fighting empty air.
The publicity was great. Chrysler had indeed made something unique, even revolutionary. Now they just needed the approval of the car-buying public.
Unfortunately, it didn't translate into the sales they're looking for on these models. And you do have to remember, it still was the Depression.
In 1934, its price tag was just under $1,500. That's a lot of money at a time when the average household income was just $1,600, and a new house could be had for around $6 grand. Chrysler spent 4 years trying to convince the car-buying public to jump on board.
They changed the grille, changed different facets of it, either make it more appealing to people. They were trying to boost sales. It just didn't resonate with the public as much as we had hoped.
In all, they sold just 30,000 of them, less than half the number of their more traditional-looking cars. In 1937, the project was canceled.
The airflow wasn't the success they had hoped for, but the engineering achievements and some of the improvements that they had done to the automobile lived on through all of our models for many years to come. So while that one model wasn't very successful, a lot of the ideas and the innovations that went into the airflow went on to become standards of the industry.
When the airflow was shelved, the car that started it all, the Trifon, disappeared into obscurity.
It sat in the engineering garage in the back of it for almost 30 years until a collector found it who was working there at Chrysler at the time. He had to research and find out what it was. I mean, even the people in engineering in the 1960s didn't know what it was. So he researched, found out what it was, and bought it from the corporation. When we were putting our collection together, he approached us and said, this is really one of those vehicles that shouldn't be in private hands. It shouldn't be in somebody else's garage that it can't be seen. And so we were able to work out a deal and bring it back into the corporate collection. Well, I think Trifon's really special in the fact that it is an engineering test vehicle. It is something that one man thought that, how do we change the automobile? How do we change basic structure and what people think of the automobile? And this vehicle is truly the first step in that. It's really the fact that somebody's vision coming to life. It's the step between a man's vision and production, and that's the Trifon. It's that where a man actually shaped and molded and what became a new automobile.
Chrysler was an established automaker when they gambled and lost on the Trifon project. In 1967, Westinghouse Electric had no experience at all in the automotive world, but they had plans to make it big with a very tiny car. The story of this boxy orange concept car actually starts on a California golf course in the 1950s.
There was a small business in Redlands, California called the Marketeer Company, and in 1951 they made golf carts. It was really the biggest golf cart manufacturer, and that was revolutionary in itself because now these guys didn't have to lug their heavy golf clubs over 18 holes. These little quiet carts could take them where they needed to go.
For 15 years, those electric carts puttered around golf courses until a global shift in perspective pulled them into the mainstream.
In 1967, big things were happening in the world. The Clean Air Act in 1963 alerted Americans to the dangers of air pollution. And then in 1966, more congressional legislation came out alerting Americans that, hey, we've got to breathe this air. We can't keep dumping pollutants into it. And automobiles were one of the major sources of air pollution. So in 1967, Westinghouse developed a golf cart into an automobile.
In 1967, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The Graduate was tops at the box office. And the U.S. military had almost 500,000 troops in Vietnam. America was being rocked with civil rights protests, anti-war protests, and a new kind of political movement was taking shape: environmentalism.
Between 1966 and 1968, the public awareness of air pollution from automobiles doubled. There was a huge awareness campaign that tied in with the Clean Air Act of 1966-67. And so Westinghouse was trying to ride that wave of public awareness. Westinghouse realized that there could be a demand for a clean air kind of automobile.
But Westinghouse was not a car company. They made televisions, radios, and washing machines. Their solution was to buy Marketeer, a small family-run outfit in California that was making golf carts, and turn it into an automaker. Their first prototype had 2 independent electric motors, one driving each rear wheel. There is no gear shift or clutch, just a locked-in 5-to-1 transmission. Because of its low speeds, aerodynamics were ignored. The body shape is boxy, to put it mildly. The desire to keep the weight down means there is very little in the way of fancy accessories. It has lights, a horn, and windshield wipers. And inside the passenger side door is a retractable cord for charging the batteries. But that's about it. The windows don't even roll down. They just lift out if you want some fresh air. The finished product was unlike anything on the road at the time.
In 1967, the American public liked big American cars, lots of steel around them, and powerful engines. They talked about acceleration, they talked about range, they talked about fitting the whole family in the car. Remember, this is the baby boom era, so there are babies everywhere, and you need big cars to accommodate those big families.
For the first round of production, Westinghouse produced 50 cars.
They were used all over the country, and people came out and gawked at them and were amazed at how quiet they were and how tiny they were. They were intended to be an around-town car, not a cruiser that would take you from city to city.
Even with the modest goal of being a car for short trips around town, it came up short. Its top speed was just 25 miles an hour, and it had limited range.
As with electric cars today, the real problem is the battery. Having a battery that lasts long enough to get you where you need to go and back without refueling. They use 12 6-volt batteries weighing about 795 pounds. Practically half the car's weight is in the batteries, and they just didn't have the range. 50 to 100 miles, a couple of hours of operation, that wasn't going to cut it with the American public.
In the end, they never stirred up enough consumer demand to warrant a move to full-scale production. Most of the prototypes have long since been destroyed. Car number 1 is still intact, but it hasn't had a peaceful retirement.
Serial number 1 was owned by Don Burnham, the CEO of Westinghouse, here in Pittsburgh. In the 1960s, he drove it every day just to demonstrate its properties. Later on, he donated it to a museum. That museum changed its mission, and they sold it at auction. Burnham found out about it. He was furious. He bid on it, bought it back, and then donated it to the Westinghouse Museum in Wilmerding, just outside of Pittsburgh. That museum was absorbed by the Heinz History Center just a few years ago, and now it's part of the permanent collection here in Pittsburgh.
The project was a financial failure for Westinghouse. But all the electric cars on the road today can trace their ancestry to the valiant attempt to turn a golf cart into a car.
I think the 1967 concept car had a couple things going for it. The small size, that subcompact size that was so different than anything else that was being produced in 1967. I think that sort of caught on with these miniature smart cars and things that people realize you don't need a big behemoth in the city. So the idea of a city car was, I think, part of that concept. The other thing, though, is the batteries. They experimented with batteries, trying to come up with something that would have a longer charge, and that's where they failed, and finally gave up.